The cold bit through Naomi Orwell's threadbare shawl like 1,000 needles as she watched the wagon train disappear into the swirling white distance, her heart sinking with each rotation of those distant wheels against the frozen earth. She had stumbled getting back into the wagon after tending to a necessary matter behind a cluster of frost-covered rocks, her ankle twisting painfully beneath her weight. And by the time she had limped back to the road, calling out with desperate lungs that burned from the icy air, the convoy had already rounded the bend, wheels creaking through snow that fell thick as cotton batting from a steel-gray sky. It was December of 1873, and the trail between Denver and the mining settlement of Golden, Colorado, had become a treacherous ribbon of ice and frozen mud, the kind of route that tested even the hardiest travelers, and Naomi was far from hardy at this moment. She stood alone on that desolate stretch of road, her full figure trembling beneath layers that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate against the mounting storm. The other travelers had made it clear throughout the journey that they found her curves unseemly, her presence an inconvenience, and now it seemed the universe had conspired with their disdain to leave her stranded in a wilderness that cared nothing for human judgment or survival. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself, the shawl doing precious little against wind that howled like something alive and angry, and she tried to think through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her mind. The wagon train would not realize she was missing until they made camp, which could be hours yet, and by then the snow would have covered all tracks, all evidence of where she had fallen behind. Her ankle throbbed with each heartbeat, swollen inside her worn leather boot, and when she tried to put weight on it, pain shot up her leg like lightning. She could walk, but slowly, painfully, and she had no idea how far the next shelter might be or if she could even find it through the thickening curtain of snow. Naomi had been traveling west to join her aunt in Golden, fleeing a life in St. Louis that had become unbearable after her father's death left her at the mercy of creditors and men with unwelcome intentions. She had scraped together every penny for passage with the wagon train, her belongings reduced to a single carpet bag that had been in the wagon, now miles away and unreachable. The wind picked up, and Naomi forced herself to start walking, limping along the road in the direction the wagons had gone, though she knew catching up was impossible. Movement would keep her warm, or at least warmer than standing still, and perhaps she would find some outcropping of rock or abandoned structure where she could wait out the storm. Her dark hair, pinned carefully that morning, had come loose and whipped around her face, strands sticking to her lips and cheeks. She could feel her fingers growing numb inside her gloves, the cheap fabric no match for this weather, and her boots were soaked through from the snow. After what felt like an eternity but could only have been 15 minutes, Naomi heard something that made her heart leap, the sound of hoofbeats behind her, muffled by snow but unmistakable. She turned, stumbling slightly on her bad ankle, and saw through the white haze a rider approaching, sitting tall on a dark horse that steamed in the cold air. Hope and fear warred in her chest, because a lone man on this road could mean salvation or something far worse, but she was in no position to be choosy about rescue. The rider drew closer, and Naomi could make out more details. A broad-shouldered man in a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the weather, a bandana covering the lower half of his face against the cold. He pulled his horse to a stop a few feet from her, and she watched as he took in the scene, his eyes, a startling shade of gray-blue visible even in the dim light, moving from her face to her sodden clothes to the empty road ahead. "You are alone," he said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact, his voice deep and slightly rough. tinged with an accent that spoke of education and perhaps Eastern origins. He pulled down the bandana, revealing a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of dark stubble, and a mouth set in a firm line that suggested both concern and determination. "My wagon train," Naomi said, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "I fell behind, twisted my ankle. They did not notice." The man's eyes darkened with something that might have been anger, though she sensed it was not directed at her. "Not on my watch," he said firmly, swinging down from his horse with easy grace despite the treacherous footing. He was tall, she realized, at least 6 feet, with the lean, muscular build of someone who lived an active life outdoors. "Isaiah Ashford," he introduced himself, already shrugging out of his coat. "And you are going to freeze to death if we do not get you warm and sheltered immediately." "Naomi Orwell," she managed to say before he draped his coat, still warm from his body heat, around her shoulders. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, and she felt tears prick at her eyes from sheer gratitude and the sudden contrast in temperature. "Can you ride?" Isaiah asked, his hands hovering near her elbows as if ready to catch her should she fall. "I think so," Naomi said, though her ankle protested even the thought of climbing onto a horse. "I do not wish to be a burden." "A burden," Isaiah repeated, and there was something almost like humor in his voice despite the dire circumstances. "Miss Orwell, you are a woman abandoned in a blizzard. Helping you is not burden, it is basic human decency, something your companions seem to have lacked." He moved to his horse, speaking soothingly to the animal, which stood steady despite the weather. "There is a line shack about a mile east, a shelter for ranch hands. It is not much, but it has 4 walls and a stove. We can wait out the worst of the storm there." Naomi wanted to protest that the wagon train had gone west, that she needed to reach Golden, but the sensible part of her brain, the part not yet frozen, understood that survival came first. Isaiah mounted his horse and then reached down, his hand extended toward her. "I am going to pull you up. It might hurt your ankle, but it cannot be helped." She placed her hand in his, surprised by the strength in his grip, and then his other arm came around her waist, and he lifted her as if she weighed nothing, settling her in front of him on the saddle. The sudden proximity was shocking, improper, and absolutely necessary. Naomi could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back, his arms coming around her to hold the reins, creating a cocoon of relative safety against the storm. "Hold on," Isaiah said close to her ear, and then they were moving, the horse picking its way carefully back along the road. Naomi clutched at the saddle horn, trying not to lean too heavily against the stranger who had appeared like something out of a fairy tale, but Isaiah seemed unconcerned with propriety. "Lean back," he instructed. "You need the warmth, and I need you conscious. No use being shy when your life depends on it." So Naomi allowed herself to lean into his solid presence, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the way his body moved with the horse's gait. She had never been this close to a man who was not family, and under any other circumstances, it would have been scandalous beyond measure. But these were not normal circumstances, and Isaiah Ashford had ridden back for her when no one else had even noticed she was gone. The ride to the line shack felt both endless and too brief. Naomi drifted in and out of awareness, the cold and shock taking their toll, and each time her consciousness wavered, she felt Isaiah's arms tighten around her, his voice rumbling in her ear with words that did not quite register, but carried the unmistakable message of safety and reassurance. When the small structure finally appeared through the snow, a squat wooden building with a sagging roof but blessedly solid walls, relief flooded through her so intensely she felt dizzy. Isaiah dismounted and lifted her down with the same effortless strength, then quickly led his horse to a lean-to attached to the side of the shack, clearly meant for this purpose. He moved with practiced efficiency, unsaddling the animal and rubbing it down with handfuls of relatively dry hay stored in a corner, speaking in low, soothing tones. Naomi leaned against the door frame of the shack, not trusting her ankle to support her, watching this man who had saved her life tend to his horse before seeing to his own comfort. Only after the horse was settled did Isaiah return to her, producing a key from his pocket and unlocking the door. "The ranch I work for maintains several of these along the route," he explained, pushing the door open and guiding her inside with a hand at her elbow. "They are supposed to be stocked with basic supplies." The interior was dim and cold, but compared to the howling wind outside, it felt like heaven. There was a small iron stove in one corner, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a pair of narrow cots along the far wall. Shelves held tins and jars, and a stack of firewood sat next to the stove along with a bucket of kindling. Isaiah settled Naomi into one of the chairs and immediately set about building a fire, his movements quick and sure. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly as flames began to lick at the kindling. "You can take one of the blankets from the cots and change behind it while I tend to the fire and see what food we have." Naomi nodded, her brain still sluggish with cold, and accepted the wool blanket he handed her. It smelled of cedar and smoke, not unpleasant, and she arranged it in a corner to give herself a modicum of privacy. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress, so stiff and clumsy that frustration brought fresh tears to her eyes. Everything was soaked through, the fabric clinging to her skin, and her corset felt like a band of ice around her ribs. "Miss Orwell," Isaiah said from the other side of the blanket, his voice carefully neutral, "if you need assistance, I assure you I am a gentleman. Your health is the priority." "I can manage," Naomi said, though she was not entirely sure that was true. She forced her fingers to work, peeling away layers of wet fabric until she stood in only her chemise and drawers, which were blessedly less soaked. There were more blankets on the second cot, and she wrapped herself in 2 of them, creating a cocoon of rough wool that prickled against her skin but was blessedly dry. When she emerged from behind her makeshift changing screen, Isaiah had the fire roaring in the stove and was examining the contents of the shelves. He had removed his own outer layers, hanging them on pegs near the stove to dry, and Naomi found herself looking at him properly for the first time. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and those remarkable gray-blue eyes that seemed to see everything. His features were strong but not harsh, his nose straight, his mouth generous beneath the stubble. "There is coffee, beans, some dried beef," Isaiah reported, pulling items from the shelves. "Not a feast, but enough to keep us going until the storm passes. How is your ankle?" "Painful," Naomi admitted, sinking back into the chair and keeping the blankets tucked firmly around her. "But I do not think it is broken." Isaiah nodded and brought a second chair over, positioning it in front of hers. "May I examine it? I have some experience with injuries." Naomi hesitated, then slowly extended her leg, keeping the blankets wrapped around the rest of her. Isaiah knelt, his hands gentle as he eased off her sodden boot and peeled down her stocking. His touch was clinical, professional, but Naomi felt heat rise to her cheeks anyway as his fingers probed carefully at the swollen joint. "A bad sprain," he announced after a moment. "You are fortunate it is not worse. We will need to keep it elevated and wrapped." He produced a relatively clean cloth from somewhere and fashioned a creditable bandage, working with a competence that spoke of practice. "You have done this before," Naomi observed. "I was a field surgeon's assistant during the war," Isaiah said, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Before I came west, you learn quickly when men's lives depend on it." He finished with the bandage and carefully propped her foot on the second chair. "The war between the states, you mean," Naomi said softly, doing the math in her head. If he had served and was now in his mid-20s, he must have been very young at the war's end 8 years ago. "I lied about my age to enlist," Isaiah said, standing and moving to the stove to start the coffee. 16 and convinced I was invincible. I learned better." He did not elaborate, and Naomi did not press. She had known enough veterans to recognize when a man did not wish to revisit those memories. Instead, she asked, "What brings you to Colorado?" Isaiah smiled slightly, the expression transforming his face from stern to something warmer. "The same thing that brings most people, a fresh start. I work for the Triple Bar Ranch about 10 miles from here, have for the past 3 years. It is good work, honest work, and the land here is beautiful when it is not trying to kill you." That surprised a laugh out of Naomi, short and sharp but genuine. "I suppose that is one way to describe it." "And you?" Isaiah asked, measuring coffee grounds into a battered pot. "What brings a woman alone to Colorado territory in December?" So Naomi told him, the words spilling out more easily than she had expected. She told him about her father's death, the debts he had left behind, the creditors who had come circling like vultures. She told him about the warehouse foreman who had cornered her more than once with sweaty hands and alcohol breath, making clear what he expected in exchange for continued employment. She told him about her aunt in Golden, a widow who ran a boarding house and had written to say there was a place for Naomi if she could make the journey. Isaiah listened without interrupting, his attention absolute as he prepared their simple meal. When she finished, he handed her a cup of coffee, black and strong and scalding hot, and said, "Your wagon train should not have left you. Accidents happen, yes, but any decent group of travelers checks on their members regularly." "They were not fond of me," Naomi admitted, wrapping her hands around the tin cup and letting the heat seep into her fingers. "The women thought me improper, too friendly with their husbands, though I did nothing to encourage attention. The men thought me either an opportunity or a nuisance depending on their character. It was not a pleasant journey even before this." Something hardened in Isaiah's expression, a flash of anger quickly controlled. People can be cruel, especially to those they perceive as different. "You deserve better." The simple kindness in his words, the matter-of-fact way he stated it as obvious truth, made Naomi's throat tight with emotion. She took a sip of coffee to cover the moment, the bitter liquid burning pleasantly down her throat. "You came back," she said quietly. "You saw the wagon train and then rode back to look for stragglers." "I saw them racing to beat the storm," Isaiah confirmed, handing her a plate with beans and dried beef warmed on the stove. "It struck me as reckless, and I have learned to trust my instincts about such things. So yes, I rode back to check the road in case someone had fallen behind or needed help. I did not expect to actually find anyone, but I am very glad I did." They ate in companionable silence, the wind howling outside and rattling the shutters while the stove pumped out blessed heat. Naomi could feel sensation returning to her extremities, the dangerous numbness receding, and with it came a bone-deep exhaustion that made her eyelids heavy. Isaiah noticed, of course, because he seemed to notice everything. "Sleep," he said gently, taking her empty plate. "You are safe here and you need rest. I will keep the fire going and wake you if anything changes." Naomi wanted to protest, to insist she was fine, but her body had other ideas. Isaiah helped her to one of the cots, supporting her so she did not have to put weight on her ankle, and tucked the blankets around her with a care that spoke of practice, perhaps younger siblings or wounded soldiers. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Isaiah settling into the chair by the stove, his profile lit by firelight, keeping watch over her as the storm raged on. She woke once in the darkest part of night to find him adding wood to the fire, moving quietly so as not to disturb her, and the sight of him there, this stranger who had become her protector, filled her with a complicated tangle of emotions she was too tired to examine. When she woke again, pale winter light was filtering through the gaps in the shutters, and the wind had died down to a low moan. Isaiah was already awake, or perhaps he had never slept, standing by the window and looking out at the new day. He turned when he heard her stirring, and his face showed relief. "How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by a horse," Naomi admitted, pushing herself into a sitting position. Her ankle was still swollen but hurt less than yesterday, and the rest of her body ached with the aftermath of cold and fear. "But alive, thanks to you." "The storm has passed," Isaiah said, moving away from the window, "or at least lessened enough for travel. We should reach Golden by afternoon if we leave within the hour. Your ankle will make walking impossible, so you will ride with me again." The thought of spending hours pressed against Isaiah Ashford should have been mortifying, but Naomi found she did not mind as much as propriety demanded she should. He had been nothing but respectful, nothing but kind, and there was something solid and reassuring about his presence that made her feel safer than she had in months. They prepared to leave with practiced efficiency. Isaiah, packing up supplies and ensuring the line shack was secured for the next traveler who might need it. He helped Naomi dress in her now dry clothes, turning his back to preserve her modesty, and she found herself studying the breadth of his shoulders, the way his hair curled against his collar. He was handsome, she admitted to herself, but more than that, he was good, and goodness was a rarer commodity than beauty. The journey to Golden was cold but clear, the sun reflecting off snow that lay thick and pristine across the landscape. Isaiah kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the town, about the gold mining that had given it its name, though most of the easy pickings were long gone. He told her about the ranch where he worked, about the horses he trained and the cattle drives each spring and fall. "You like it?" Naomi asked, her back pressed against his chest, his arms bracketing her securely. "The cowboy's life." Isaiah was quiet for a moment, considering. "I like the honesty of it," he finally said. "The work is hard, but it is real. A horse does not care about your past or your mistakes. The land does not judge. After the war, after everything I saw and did, I needed that simplicity." Naomi understood that better than she could say. "I think that is why I am fleeing west as well. In St. Louis, I was always my father's daughter, the girl from the failed business, the woman whose curves make her unseemly. I am hoping in Golden I can just be Naomi, whoever that turns out to be." "I think Naomi is just fine as she is," Isaiah said, and there was a warmth in his voice that made her heart skip strangely in her chest. Golden appeared before them like something out of a dream, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley with the mountains rising majestically behind. Smoke rose from chimneys, and people moved through streets that had been cleared of snow, going about their daily business. It was not large, perhaps 1,000 souls, but it looked established, civilized, a place where a person could build a life. Isaiah guided his horse down the main street, drawing a few curious glances but no undue attention. Cowboys riding double were uncommon but not unheard of, and in a frontier town, people generally minded their own business. "Where is your aunt's boarding house?" he asked. "Washington Avenue," the letter said. "The Mountain View boarding house," Naomi replied, looking around with interest at what was to be her new home. Isaiah nodded, clearly familiar with the location, and turned down a side street. The boarding house, when they reached it, was a tidy two-story structure painted white with green shutters. A sign hanging by the door announcing its name and proclaiming clean rooms and good food. Naomi felt a surge of relief at the sight of it, at the evidence that her aunt's letters had been true, that this sanctuary was real. Isaiah dismounted and lifted Naomi down, steadying her when her ankle protested the movement. The front door opened before they could knock, and a woman emerged, tall and spare, with Naomi's same dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined but kind. "Naomi," she said, her voice uncertain. "Is that you?" "Aunt Constance," Naomi breathed, and then she was enveloped in a hug that smelled of lavender and fresh bread, her aunt's arms strong around her. "We heard about the wagon train arriving early this morning," Constance said, pulling back to look at Naomi with searching eyes. "But you were not with them. I was sick with worry, preparing to send men out to search. I fell behind," Naomi explained, and the whole story came spilling out: the accident, the abandonment, the storm. Isaiah stood quietly to the side, holding his horse's reins, clearly preparing to leave now that his duty was discharged. Constance listened with growing outrage, her lips pressed into a thin line. When Naomi finished, her aunt turned to Isaiah with eyes that glittered with fierce gratitude. "You saved my niece's life, young man. I am forever in your debt." "Any decent person would have done the same," Isaiah said, but Constance waved away his modesty. "Decency is rarer than it should be, as yesterday's events prove. Please come inside. The least I can do is feed you a proper meal and make sure you are supplied for your journey back to your ranch." It was not a request but a command, delivered with the authority of a woman used to running a household, and Isaiah smiled. "I would be honored, madam." The interior of the boarding house was warm and welcoming, with lace curtains in the windows and the smell of something delicious baking. Constance settled Naomi on a sofa in the parlor with her foot elevated and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with tea and cookies while she prepared something more substantial. Isaiah sat in a chair across from Naomi, suddenly seeming unsure now that the emergency had passed, and they were in civilization with its rules and expectations. "I suppose this is where we say goodbye," Naomi said softly, and was surprised by how much the thought pained her. This man had been in her life for less than 24 hours, but in that time he had shown her a kindness and respect she had rarely experienced. The thought of never seeing him again felt wrong somehow, like a story ending in the middle of a chapter. Isaiah looked at her, and something complicated passed across his face. "I suppose it is," he agreed, but he did not sound happy about it either. "Unless," he started, then stopped, seeming to reconsider. "Unless," Naomi prompted, her heart beating faster. "Unless you would not object to me calling on you," Isaiah said in a rush, the words tumbling out as if he had to say them quickly or lose his nerve. "Properly, I mean, with your aunt as chaperone. I know we have only just met, and under unusual circumstances, but I find myself not wanting this to be the end of our acquaintance." Joy flooded through Naomi, bright and warm. "I would like that very much," she said, and the smile that broke across Isaiah's face was like the sun emerging from clouds. Constance returned with bowls of stew and thick slices of bread, her eyes moving between Naomi and Isaiah with the perceptive gaze of a woman who had not lived 56 years without learning to read a room. She said nothing, however, merely served the food and sat down to eat with them, asking Isaiah polite questions about his work and his life in the territory. Isaiah stayed for 2 hours, and when he finally prepared to leave, the light outside had shifted to the golden hue of late afternoon. Constance disappeared discreetly to give them a moment of privacy, though Naomi noticed she stayed within earshot, as was proper. "I will come back on Sunday," Isaiah said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "If that is acceptable." "Sunday," Naomi agreed, her heart full of an unfamiliar lightness. "I will look forward to it." Isaiah seemed to want to say more, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing her features. Finally, he said simply, "I am very glad I rode back yesterday. Meeting you, Naomi Orwell, feels like the most important thing I have done in a very long time." Then he was gone, swinging into his saddle and riding away down the snow-dusted street, and Naomi watched him until he turned the corner and disappeared from view. When she turned back inside, Constance was standing in the hallway with an expression that was equal parts amused and approving. "He seems like a good man," her aunt said simply. "He is," Naomi agreed, and felt the truth of it down to her bones. The days until Sunday felt both endless and too short. Constance kept Naomi busy despite her injured ankle, teaching her the rhythms of the boarding house, introducing her to the residents, a mixed group of miners, merchants, and drifters who paid their rent on time and appreciated good cooking. Naomi found she enjoyed the work, the sense of purpose and contribution, so different from her last months in St. Louis where she had felt useless and unwanted. The town's doctor, a gruff older man named Henderson, came to examine her ankle and pronounced it healing well, instructing her to stay off it as much as possible for another week. The women of the town began to call, curious about the newcomer, and Naomi found herself telling the story of her abandonment and rescue so many times it began to feel like something that had happened to someone else. The reactions were universally sympathetic. The wagon master who had led her party apparently known for his mercenary approach to travel, and several women went out of their way to assure Naomi that she would find Golden far more welcoming than her wagon train had been. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, was particularly kind, arriving with a basket of supplies including a warm woolen dress in a rich burgundy that she insisted Naomi accept as a welcome gift. "It was meant for my daughter, but she ran off to San Francisco with a gambler last spring," Mrs. Patterson said with a mixture of exasperation and resignation. "It will fit you better than it ever fit her willowy frame, and the color will suit you beautifully." Naomi tried to protest, but Mrs. Patterson would hear none of it, and Constance sided with the shopkeeper. "Accept the kindness, dear," her aunt said gently. "People here help each other. That is how we survive." So Naomi accepted and found herself looking forward to Sunday with an anticipation that grew with each passing day. She told herself it was merely gratitude, that any woman would look forward to seeing the man who saved her life, but she knew in her heart it was more than that. There had been something in Isaiah's eyes when he looked at her, a warmth and interest that had nothing to do with pity or duty, and she wanted to explore what that might mean. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the sky an impossible blue above the snow-covered mountains. Naomi dressed carefully in the burgundy dress, which fit perfectly over her curves, the cut both modest and flattering. Constance helped her pin up her hair, leaving a few curls to frame her face, and stepped back to survey the result with satisfaction. "You look lovely," her aunt pronounced. "That young man will not know what hit him." Isaiah arrived precisely at 2 o'clock as they had arranged, dressed in clean trousers and a pressed shirt with a string tie, his hair still damp from being freshly washed. He carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, which he presented to Constance with a slight bow. I was not sure what might be appropriate, but the ranch cook makes excellent preserves. Constance accepted the jars of wild berry preserves with genuine pleasure and ushered Isaiah into the parlor where Naomi waited, her ankle much improved, but still propped on a cushioned stool. The look on his face, when he saw her, made every minute of preparation worthwhile. "Miss Orwell," he said, and his voice was just slightly unsteady. "You look wonderful." "Thank you," Naomi said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Please sit. Tell me how your week has been." So began the first of many Sunday afternoons. Isaiah called on Naomi faithfully every week, sometimes twice a week when his work allowed, always proper, always respectful, always under Constance's watchful but approving eye. They talked for hours, discovering shared interests and differences, learning the shapes of each other's thoughts and dreams. Isaiah told her about growing up in Philadelphia, the youngest of 5 children in a family of modest means. His father had been a schoolteacher, his mother a seamstress, and they had instilled in their children a love of learning and a strong moral compass. The war had shattered his youthful idealism, but it had also taught him resilience and the value of life. Naomi told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her mother who had died when she was 12, leaving her to keep house for her father while trying to navigate adolescence alone. She told him about the books she loved to read, the dreams she'd had of maybe becoming a teacher herself before circumstances intervened. She confessed her fears that she was not brave enough for frontier life, that she would somehow fail at this fresh start. "You walked a mile through a blizzard on a sprained ankle," Isaiah reminded her gently. "You left everything familiar to travel 1,000 miles to a place you had never seen. You are far braver than you give yourself credit for, Naomi." As the weeks passed and winter deepened, their friendship grew into something more. Isaiah began to find excuses to touch her hand, to sit closer on the sofa when they looked at books together. Naomi found herself thinking about him at odd moments throughout the day, smiling at memories of things he had said or the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. It was Constance who finally addressed the elephant in the room, cornering Isaiah one Sunday in early February as he was preparing to leave. "Your intentions toward my niece," she said bluntly. "What are they?" Isaiah did not pretend to misunderstand. "Entirely honorable, madam. I am courting her if she will have me. I would like permission to continue doing so with the eventual goal of marriage should Naomi be willing." "And you can support a wife," Constance pressed, "on a cowboy's wages." "I have been saving for 3 years," Isaiah said steadily. "I own 40 acres of land just outside town, purchased last year. The ranch boss has agreed to let me build a house on it and continue working for the Triple Bar until I can get my own herd started. It would not be an easy life, especially at first, but it would be an honest one, and I would do everything in my power to make Naomi happy." Constance studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "She cares for you more than she says. Do not make me regret giving you my blessing." "I will not, madam," Isaiah promised. "You have my word." He proposed on the first warm day of spring, in April when the snow had finally melted and wildflowers dotted the meadows in explosions of color. Isaiah took Naomi to see his land, helping her up into a small wagon he had borrowed, driving them out of town and into the hills where his 40 acres spread across a gentle slope, with a view of the mountains that took her breath away. "I know it is not much yet," Isaiah said, helping her down from the wagon. "Just land and dreams. But I see a house there," he pointed to a level spot near a stand of aspens, "and a barn there and maybe someday fields and a proper herd. I see a life, Naomi. A good life." and I want to share it with you." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his, and the look in his eyes was so full of emotion that Naomi felt her own eyes sting with tears. "I know we have not known each other long," Isaiah continued, "only 4 months. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are brave and kind and beautiful, and when I look at you, I see my future. Naomi Orwell, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Naomi said, the word barely more than a whisper, then louder, "Yes, Isaiah. Yes." His smile was incandescent, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her close, and Naomi felt as if every difficult moment of her life had led to this man and this place and this perfect, improbable happiness. When Isaiah finally pulled back enough to look at her face, he asked, "May I kiss you?" Naomi nodded, suddenly shy, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and sweet and filled with promise. It was her first real kiss, and it felt like coming home. They were married 6 weeks later in late May, in a small ceremony at the church in Golden with half the town in attendance. Constance cried through the entire service, and Mrs. Patterson provided the cake, a towering confection that must have cost a fortune in sugar and butter. Isaiah's ranch boss, a weathered man named Cole Turner, stood up as best man, and Constance served as matron of honor. Naomi wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Constance had been saving for years, made over to fit Naomi's fuller figure, and Isaiah wore a new suit that had been his wedding gift to himself. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Isaiah kissed her with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of such moments, and Naomi felt joy so profound it was almost painful. They spent their wedding night in a room at the boarding house, Constance having tactfully made herself scarce, and Isaiah was patient and gentle as they learned each other in new ways. Naomi had been nervous, her knowledge of marital relations limited to vague warnings and whispered gossip. But Isaiah made it beautiful, taking his time, ensuring her comfort and pleasure. "I love you," he whispered against her hair as they lay together afterward, and Naomi realized it was the first time either of them had said the words aloud, though they had been implied in every touch and glance for months. "I love you too," she whispered back. "So much it terrifies me." "I know," Isaiah said, pulling her closer. "I am terrified too, but we will face it together." The house Isaiah built on their land was small but sturdy. One main room that served as kitchen and living space, a bedroom that just fit a bed and dresser, and a loft that could be used for storage or future children. He worked on it every spare moment, and Naomi helped as much as she could, learning to chink logs and mix mortar. By July, they were able to move in, and Naomi set about making the rough space into a home. She sewed curtains from fabric misses. Patterson sold her at cost, planted a vegetable garden behind the house, and learned to cook on the iron stove that had been a gift from the ranch hands at the Triple Bar. Isaiah built her a table and chairs, a bookshelf for the small collection of volumes they had begun to accumulate, and a rocking chair that he promised would be useful someday. Life was hard but good. Isaiah left before dawn most mornings to work at the ranch, returning after dark exhausted and smelling of horses and honest sweat. Naomi kept their home, tended her garden, and took in mending and laundry from some of the bachelors in town to earn extra money. They were building something together, she and Isaiah, creating a life from nothing but love and determination. In August, Naomi realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, the subtle changes in her body unmistakable, but she waited to be sure before telling Isaiah. When she finally did, presenting him with the news after dinner one evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of joy that probably carried to the neighboring ranch, swept her into his arms, and spun her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly, setting her down gently as if she were made of glass. "You are going to be a mother." "And you are going to be a father," Naomi said, cupping his face in her hands. "A wonderful father. The pregnancy was not easy." Naomi suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, barely able to keep food down, and Isaiah fretted over her like a mother hen despite her assurances that it was normal. As winter approached again, marking a full year since that frozen day on the road when their paths had crossed, Naomi grew large and uncomfortable, her belly swelling with their child. Dr. Henderson checked on her regularly, pronouncing both mother and baby healthy despite Naomi's discomfort. "First babies take their time," he told her gruffly when she complained about how slowly the months were passing. "You just rest and let your body do its work." The baby came in early March, during a late-season snowstorm that felt like an echo of the blizzard that had brought Isaiah into Naomi's life. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through a night and most of the following day. Isaiah paced outside while Constance and Mrs. Patterson attended to Naomi, holding her hands and wiping her brow and encouraging her through each wave of pain. When the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being forced into the cold world, Naomi wept with relief and joy. Isaiah was allowed in to meet his son, and the look on his face when Dr. Henderson placed the tiny bundle in his arms was one Naomi knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "He is perfect," Isaiah breathed, touching one finger to the baby's impossibly small hand, which immediately grasped it with surprising strength. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas after Isaiah's father, with the middle name of James for Naomi's. Thomas Ashford was a healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, and from the beginning, he had strong lungs and firm opinions about when he should be fed and held. Parenthood transformed them both. Isaiah became even more devoted, if that were possible, working longer hours to provide for his growing family while still making time to help with the baby, whenever he was home. Naomi discovered reserves of strength and patience she had not known she possessed, navigating the exhausting early months of motherhood with determination and growing confidence. By the time Thomas was 6 months old, Isaiah had saved enough to purchase 10 head of cattle, the beginning of their own herd. It was not much, but it was a start, and Naomi felt pride watching her husband work his own land, building their future one day at a time. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Thomas learned to walk, then run, then ride, showing an early affinity for horses that delighted his father. A second baby came when Thomas was 3, a daughter they named Grace Catherine, who had Naomi's curls and Isaiah's gray-blue eyes. She was quieter than her brother, more contemplative, watching the world with serious attention before deciding how to engage with it. Naomi's garden expanded into a substantial operation, producing enough vegetables to sell at the market in Golden each week, and she began keeping chickens, then a few pigs. Isaiah's herd grew slowly but steadily, and after 5 years he was able to leave his position at the Triple Bar and focus entirely on their ranch. They were not wealthy, not even close, but they had enough, and more importantly, they had each other. The boarding house remained a fixture in their lives. Constance grew older but no less formidable, and the children adored their great-aunt, who always had cookies and stories. She taught Grace to sew and Thomas to read, and her pride in Naomi's family was evident to anyone who spent 5 minutes in her presence. In the spring of 1881, 7 years after that fateful day on the frozen road, Naomi stood on the porch of their expanded house, watching Isaiah teach Thomas to rope fence posts while Grace picked wildflowers in the meadow. Her hand rested on her swelling belly, another baby due in the fall, and she felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. Isaiah looked up, catching her watching, and his smile was the same one he had given her that first Sunday afternoon in Constance's parlor, full of warmth and love and promise. He said something to Thomas that made the boy giggle, then walked over to the porch, climbing the steps to stand beside his wife. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping an arm around her expanding waist. "About how different my life is from what I imagined that day on the wagon train," Naomi said honestly. "I thought I was going to Golden to Hyde to start over in obscurity and safety. I never imagined this." She gestured at the land, the children, the life they had built. "No regrets?" Isaiah asked, and though his tone was light, she heard the genuine question beneath it. "Not a single one," Naomi said firmly, turning to face him. "You saved my life that day, Isaiah, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Isaiah corrected gently. "I was just existing before you, Naomi, going through the motions. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build instead of just survive." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Naomi leaned into him, still marveling after all these years at the solid reality of his love. Thomas called out something about successfully roping a post, and Grace came running with a bouquet of slightly crushed flowers, and the moment broke into happy chaos, as moments with small children inevitably did. The third baby, born in October, was another boy, Samuel Isaiah, who came into the world much faster than his siblings, as if eager to join the family. He was a happy baby, quick to smile and laugh, and his presence completed their family in a way that felt exactly right. As the years continued to pass, the ranch prospered. Isaiah's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled horseman spread, and he was able to expand their herd and purchase an additional 20 acres adjacent to their original land. They built a proper barn and hired seasonal help during busy times, usually young men looking for experience and honest work. Thomas grew into a serious young man with his father's steady nature and his mother's compassionate heart. Grace became a skilled horsewoman and an even better student, devouring every book she could get her hands on and dreaming of becoming a teacher. Samuel was the wild one, always into mischief, but with a charm that made it impossible to stay angry with him for long. Naomi watched her children grow with a mixture of pride and the bittersweet knowledge that they would eventually leave to build their own lives. But that was as it should be, she knew. She and Isaiah had given them roots and wings, security and independence, and when the time came, they would let them fly. In the summer of 1890, 16 years after Isaiah had ridden back through a blizzard to find a stranded woman on a frozen road, the family gathered to celebrate Thomas's 15th birthday. The house and barn were full of neighbors and friends, testament to the place the Ashfords had carved out in the community. Constance, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, held court in a comfortable chair, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of the old days. As the sun set and people began to drift home, Isaiah and Naomi found themselves alone for a moment on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Naomi leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, unchanged by the years except for a few threads of silver in his dark hair and lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into the sun and smiling often. "You ever think about that day?" Naomi asked softly. "About what might have happened if you had not ridden back?" Isaiah was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "I try not to," he admitted. "The thought of you dying alone in that storm, of never having met you, of this life not existing, it is not something I can contemplate for long." "But you did ride back," Naomi said. "Against logic, against the easier choice of just going home, you rode back. Why?" Isaiah considered the question seriously, as he considered most things. "I think some part of me knew," he finally said. "Knew that something important was waiting on that road. Knew that my life was about to change. I cannot explain it better than that. It was instinct or fate or the hand of God. Whatever you want to call it, I am grateful for it every single day." "Not on my watch," Naomi murmured, remembering his words from that first meeting, the determination in his voice when he had declared that she would not freeze to death if he had anything to say about it. Isaiah laughed, the sound warm and full. "I had no idea what I was signing up for when I said that. I thought I was just helping a stranded traveler. I did not know I was meeting my future wife, the mother of my children, the love of my life." "Life is funny that way," Naomi said, turning to kiss him. "The best things sneak up on you when you least expect them." They stood together as the night deepened, and the sounds of their children and guests faded to comfortable quiet. The ranch, their home, spread around them, solid and real and built from nothing but love and determination. Somewhere inside, Grace was probably still reading by lamplight, and Samuel was likely avoiding bedtime with creative excuses, and Thomas was growing into the man he would become. It was not the life Naomi had imagined for herself when she left St. Louis, desperate and alone. It was so much better. She had found not just safety in Golden, Colorado, but purpose and love and a family that filled her heart to overflowing. And it had all started with a cowboy who had ridden back through a blizzard, because his instincts told him someone might need help. As Isaiah often said when telling their story to the children, sometimes the best decisions are the ones we make without thinking, the ones that come from the heart rather than the head. Riding back that day had been one of those decisions, and it had changed everything. The years continued to unfold in their steady rhythm. The turn of the century came and went, bringing with it new technologies and changes that reached even their corner of Colorado. The ranch adapted and grew, and Isaiah's skill with horses made him sought after as a trainer and breeder. Naomi's garden became legendary in the area, and she taught other women her techniques for coaxing vegetables from the sometimes stubborn soil. Thomas, at 20, married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, a sensible young woman named Emma who fit into the family as if she had always been there. They built a house on a portion of the Ashford land that Isaiah deeded to them, keeping the ranch in the family and ensuring that the work of their hands would continue into the next generation. Grace, true to her dreams, went to Denver to attend normal school and became a teacher, returning to Golden to instruct at the growing schoolhouse. She married at 23, a banker's son named William who adored her and supported her passion for education. They built a house in town, and Grace taught for another 5 years before their own children arrived, 2 daughters who inherited their mother's love of learning. Samuel was the last to settle, spending his late teens and early 20s working on various ranches and seeing more of the West before concluding that nowhere else felt quite like home. He returned at 24 with a bride, a spirited woman named Clara he had met in Wyoming, and together they took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, allowing Isaiah and Naomi to finally slow down a bit. Constance passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1903 at the age of 79, leaving behind a legacy of kindness and the boarding house that had been her life's work. Naomi and her children mourned her deeply, but they took comfort in knowing she had lived a full life and had been surrounded by love until the end. As Isaiah and Naomi entered their 50s, they found themselves in the strange position of being the older generation, the ones people came to for advice and wisdom. Their hair had gone gray, their faces lined with the evidence of hard work and frequent laughter, but their love remained as strong as ever, tempered and deepened by decades of shared life. They took long walks in the evenings when weather permitted, hand in hand like young sweethearts, talking about everything and nothing. They sat on the porch and watched their grandchildren play, 7 in total, each one a miracle and a joy. They attended church socials and town meetings, voted in elections, and watched the world change around them while their core remained constant. In the spring of 1908, 34 years after that blizzard and that chance meeting, Isaiah woke Naomi before dawn with a gentle kiss. "Come with me," he said mysteriously. "I want to show you something." Naomi dressed and followed him outside where 2 horses stood saddled and ready. They rode in companionable silence to a high point on their land, arriving just as the sun began to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Below them, the ranch spread out in the growing light, the expanded house, the sturdy barn, the corrals and pastures where cattle grazed and horses ran. In the distance, they could see the smoke rising from Thomas's house, and further still, the town of Golden nestled in its valley. "I wanted to see it like this," Isaiah said quietly, his arm around Naomi's waist as they stood together. "To remember it exactly as it is right now, this moment of perfect peace before the day begins and everything gets busy and complicated." Naomi leaned into him, understanding without need for explanation. They were not young anymore. The years ahead were uncertain, and both of them knew that the time they had left together, while hopefully still substantial, was no longer infinite. This was a moment to hold on to preserve in memory against whatever the future might bring. "Thank you," Naomi said softly. "For what?" Isaiah asked, turning to look at her with those gray-blue eyes that still made her heart skip. "For riding back," Naomi said simply. "For seeing me when no one else did. For loving me and building this life with me. For every day of these 34 years. For everything." Isaiah cupped her face in his work-roughened hands, hands that had built their home and delivered foals and held their babies, and touched her with unchanging love through all the years. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done," he said. "The honor and the privilege of my life. If I had to do it all again, I would not change a single moment." He kissed her there on the hilltop as the sun rose fully, bathing the world in golden light, and Naomi kissed him back with all the passion and tenderness that decades of marriage had only intensified. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, and the day stretched before them full of promise and ordinary miracles. They rode back to the house for breakfast, where Samuel and Clara would soon arrive to discuss the day's work, and where the smell of coffee and frying bacon would welcome them home. It was a small moment, one of thousands they had shared, but it was perfect in its simplicity and its truth. The years had tested them in countless ways, as years always do. There had been droughts and harsh winters, sick children and financial worries, moments of doubt and fear and grief. But through it all, they had held onto each other and the promise they had made before God and community. To love and honor in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death parted them. And if that frozen December day in 1873 had taught them anything, it was that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes, that disaster and blessing are sometimes separated by nothing more than the decision of one person to do the right thing, to refuse to look the other way, to ride back through a storm because someone might need help. Isaiah had ridden back, and in doing so, he had not just saved Naomi's life. He had created a family, built a legacy, and proved that love can bloom even in the harshest conditions if tended with care and commitment. The curvy girl left behind on a frozen road had become a rancher's wife, a mother, a grandmother, a pillar of her community. And the cowboy who had said, "Not on my watch," had become her partner in every sense of the word, the foundation on which she had built a life beyond her wildest dreams. As they sat down to breakfast that spring morning in 1908, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, they knew they had been blessed beyond measure. Not because their path had been easy, but because they had walked it together, hand in hand, heart to heart, from that first frozen moment to this warm spring dawn and all the years between. And when, years later, they told their grandchildren and great-grandchildren the story of how they met, those children would listen with wide eyes to the tale of the blizzard, and the abandoned woman, and the cowboy who rode back. They would ask questions and demand details, and Isaiah and Naomi would oblige, reliving that pivotal day with the clarity that important memories retain. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was not about a single day of drama and rescue. It was about all the days that came after, the ordinary moments of building a life, raising a family, weathering storms both literal and metaphorical. It was about choosing each other again and again, in big ways and small, through joy and hardship, success and failure, youth and age. It was about love in the end. The kind of love that rides back through blizzards, that builds houses and plants gardens, that soothes crying babies and teaches children to read, that buries parents and celebrates grandchildren, that grows deeper and stronger with each passing year instead of fading or becoming comfortable complacency. Isaiah and Naomi Ashford lived into their 70s, seeing the ranch pass fully into Samuel's capable hands, watching their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own, witnessing the world change in ways they could never have imagined as young people. Through it all, they remained each other's first choice, each other's safe harbor, each other's home. When Isaiah finally passed away in 1922 at the age of 74, after a brief illness that gave them time to say goodbye but not so long that he suffered unduly, Naomi held his hand and whispered the words they had said to each other countless times. "I love you." Not a single regret. Isaiah smiled, the expression peaceful, and squeezed her hand with what strength remained. "Not on my watch," he whispered back, their private joke, their shared history, their beginning and their constant. "See you soon, my love." Naomi lived another 3 years, long enough to hold her first great-great-grandchild, a tiny girl with dark hair and gray-blue eyes who might have been Grace reborn. She spent those years surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that the life she and Isaiah had built would continue long after both of them were gone. When she died peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1925, just shy of her 77th birthday, the ranch and the town mourned a woman who had embodied the best of frontier spirit, resilience, kindness, and an unwavering commitment to family and community. She was buried next to Isaiah on a hill overlooking their land, under a stone that bore both their names and a simple inscription, "Together always." And if sometimes, on winter evenings when the snow falls thick and the wind howls down from the mountains, people claim to see 2 riders on the hill where the Ashfords are buried, horses moving in perfect synchronization, the figures leaning toward each other as if in conversation or perhaps a kiss, well, that is just the wind and the weather playing tricks on the eyes. Or perhaps it is something more, something that speaks to the power of a love that began on a frozen road and lasted far beyond the confines of mortal life. The Ashford Ranch continued for generations, worked by descendants who inherited not just land and cattle, but a legacy of integrity and love. The story of how it all began, of the curvy girl abandoned in a blizzard and the cowboy who rode back, became family legend, told and retold until it took on the sheen of myth while remaining absolutely, fundamentally true. Because sometimes in life, everything truly does hinge on a single decision, a single moment of choosing compassion over convenience, courage over comfort. Isaiah Ashford's decision to ride back through a storm changed everything, not just for him and Naomi, but for the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who followed, who owed their very existence to one man's refusal to leave someone behind. And Naomi's decision to trust that stranger, to accept his help and eventually his love, was equally crucial. She could have hardened her heart after betrayal and abandonment, could have let fear and bitterness rule her remaining days. Instead, she chose hope, chose to believe in kindness, chose to open herself to the possibility of love even when experience had given her every reason to shut down. Together, they created something beautiful and lasting from the raw materials of a frozen December day and two lonely hearts. They proved that happy endings are not just for fairy tales, that sometimes the person who saves you becomes the person you cannot imagine living without, that love found in the most unlikely circumstances can be the truest and strongest love of all. The house they built still stands, renovated and modernized but recognizably, the same structure Isaiah raised with his own hands, and Naomi turned into a home with her determination and care. The land still produces cattle and horses, still shows the evidence of careful stewardship passed down through generations. And the story of Isaiah and Naomi still lives, a reminder that heroism is not always dramatic, that sometimes it is simply riding back through a storm, refusing to let someone suffer alone, choosing love when fear would be easier. In the end, that frozen December day in 1873, when a curvy girl named Naomi Orwell was left behind on a frozen road, and a cowboy named Isaiah Ashford rode back and said, "Not on my watch," was the beginning of more than just a marriage. It was the beginning of a legacy, a testament to the transformative power of compassion and courage, and a love story that would be remembered and celebrated long after the people who lived it had returned to the earth they worked so hard to tend. It was, quite simply, the beginning of everything that mattered.